May 25, 1979. It's a Friday in Soho, Manhattan. 6-year-old Etan Patz leaves his parents' apartment. He's wearing this black cap with future flight captain written across it, a blue corduroy jacket, and blue sneakers with these fluorescent stripes.
Right.
And he is holding a single-dollar bill because his plan is to buy a soda to drink with his lunch.
And, for his parents, Stan and Julie, this was a huge milestone of independence.
Oh, sure.
It was the very first time they were allowing him to walk the 2 short blocks down Prince Street to his school bus stop entirely by himself. I mean, he just had to cross one street.
Just one street. But he never gets on the bus. When Etan doesn't come home from school that afternoon, his mother immediately calls the police, and that triggers a mobilization that New York had really never seen for a missing child before.
Never.
The NYPD floods the area with nearly 100 officers on the ground. They bring in bloodhounds to sniff through all the alleys and basements. They've got helicopters chopping through the sky over lower Manhattan.
And his father was a photographer, right?
Yes. Etan's father is a professional photographer, so the police take his high-quality portraits of Etan's smiling, shaggy-haired face, and they project them massively onto the screens in Times Square.
Oh, wow. And that specific photograph just becomes burned into the public consciousness. Years later, Etan Patz becomes one of the very first missing children to be featured on a milk carton, which pushed his face onto breakfast tables in literally every state.
Yeah.
The sheer visibility of this localized New York tragedy rapidly metastasizes into what sociologists now refer to as the missing children panic of the 1980s.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the psychological impact on parents during this era must have been just suffocating. I mean, you have an entire society that essentially operates on the let the kids roam the neighborhood until the streetlights come on philosophy.
Right, that was just how it was.
Exactly. And then there is the sudden jarring loss of cultural innocence. Almost overnight, every stranger walking down the block is a potential threat, and every shadow feels like it's hiding a monster.
What's fascinating here is how the media and pop culture essentially weaponized that parental terror.
Oh, totally.
Throughout the early 1980s, television broadcasts and news magazines frequently cited claims that 1.5 million children disappeared or were abducted every single year in the United States.
Wait, 1.5 million? That isn't a statistic. That's like an apocalyptic scenario. That implies a child is being snatched off the street every few seconds.
I know. It absolutely fueled a nationwide hysteria. But the forensic reality, however, was vastly different. When researchers and lawmakers eventually dug into the data, statistics showed that over 95% of those missing children cases were actually teenage runaways, or they involved complex custody disputes between parents.
Oh, okay.
The actual number of children abducted by strangers, which is the nightmare scenario that happened to Etan Patz, was a few hundred a year.
Still horrific, but yeah, vastly different from 1.5 million.
Exactly. But the public perception had already completely blurred those lines. The nuance didn't matter at that point, The fear had already taken root.
And you see that fear bleed directly into entertainment, too. The culture just completely absorbs the trauma. The sources highlight how in 1983, a TV docudrama called Adam aired, which detailed a real-life child abduction, and it reached up to 50 million viewers.
Wow.
50 million people sitting in their living rooms absorbing this horror. You even see it manifest in the horror genre. The fictional character Freddy Krueger in A Nightmare on Elm Street was created right in the middle of this panic in 1984.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. He is literally the ultimate stranger danger predator, the monster who comes for your children in the one place you can't protect them when you aren't looking.
That intense, inescapable cultural panic forced a profound reckoning in the legal system. Etan's disappearance was the catalyst that primed the public. But the actual framework of laws we live under today was built reactively, case by case, through a succession of localized tragedies. Lawmakers were basically scrambling to build a safety net that simply didn't exist in 1979.
Yeah, you look at the timeline of the 80s and 90s, and it reads like this grim evolution of policy trying to catch up with this new parental reality. It starts with the institutional foundation. The 1981 abduction of Adam Walsh from a Florida department store leads to the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, which creates the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
Right, the NCMEC.
Exactly. So suddenly there is a centralized federal hub for these cases.
Then the legislative focus shifts toward community awareness and transparency. So in 1989, Jacob Wetterling is abducted by a masked man in Minnesota. And that's a case that eventually drives the passage of the very first Sex Offender Registry Act in 1994.
In that same year, 1994, the push for transparency becomes a demand for public notification. 7-year-old Megan Kanka is murdered in New Jersey. The killer is her neighbor, a man who had 2 prior arrests for sexual assault on children, but the community had absolutely no idea he was living across the street.
Which is just terrifying.
It really is. And that sparks Megan's Law, which mandated that communities be actively notified of sex offenders living in their area.
Right. And then the final evolution in this wave of legislation was the demand for rapid, real-time response. The 1996 abduction and murder of 9-year-old Amber Hageman in Texas led to the Amber Alert system. The goal there was to instantly mobilize the entire public the moment a child is taken. And our sources note that in places like the Netherlands, their equivalent Amber Alert system boasts an incredible 94% success rate.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But these sweeping laws didn't just materialize out of thin air to soothe anxious parents. They were constructed on some incredibly grim, specific data.
They were. A landmark study by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the OJJDP, laid out the chilling mechanics of stranger abductions. They found that 80% of abducted children are taken within a quarter mile of their last known location.
Wow, that close.
Yeah. And the abductors are overwhelmingly male, often unemployed, or working in transient fields like construction, where they might have a legitimate reason to be lingering in a residential neighborhood.
Right, blending in.
Exactly. But the most devastating statistic, however, is the timeline. Almost all children abducted by a stranger are murdered within 24 hours.
See, that 24-hour window completely changes the context of these policies for me. I mean, if a crime is happening that incredibly fast, if it's a hyper-fast crime of opportunity, do sweeping laws like lifetime registries actually prevent these crimes from happening in the first place? Or are we looking at a system that is essentially a knee-jerk reaction designed to severely punish the offender long after the horrific damage is already done?
This raises an important question, and it is the exact friction point where the demand for public safety collides directly with fundamental civil liberties.
And I want to be really clear with you listening right now. We aren't taking sides on this. We're just neutrally presenting the deep tension here because it's profound. On one side, you have grieving parents, families like the Kankas, arguing that if they had just been equipped with basic awareness of their neighbor's criminal record, their daughter would likely still be alive today.
Right.
Their argument is that the right to life for an innocent child supersedes an offender's right to privacy.
And on the other side of that legal battlefield, organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union and Human Rights Watch argue that mandatory minimum sentences and lifetime registries fundamentally infringe on constitutional rights, specifically the First Amendment. Their legal stance is that these registries punish individuals who have already served their sentence and paid their debt to society. Furthermore, they argue these laws apply blanket, lifetime restrictions without ever conducting a nuanced assessment of an individual's actual psychological risk of reoffending.
It effectively acts as a permanent societal branding. The sources actually highlight a fascinating point from Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas on this exact issue. He noted that the widespread public dissemination of names and photos acts as a kind of shaming punishment. It legally disables offenders from ever reintegrating or living normally within a community, which civil rights advocates argue only increases the desperation and alienation that leads to further crime.
It forces a society to weigh the immeasurable value of a child's safety against the constitutional guarantees of a rehabilitated citizen. It is an ethical tightrope that lawmakers are still trying to walk today.
Yeah. And while the entire nation spent decades locked in these high-level debates about registries, civil liberties, and constitutional rights, Etan's parents, Stan and Julie Patz, were trapped in a horrific, agonizing limbo.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
They continued to live in the exact same Soho apartment. They kept the exact same landline phone number because it was the one number Etan had memorized. They lived their lives waiting for the phone to ring with an answer.
And for a very long time, investigators and the public assumed they knew the answer. For decades, the prime suspect was a man named Jose Ramos. He was a convicted pedophile who had actually dated a woman hired to walk Etan home during a school bus strike.
Ugh.
Yeah. And when investigators searched a drain pipe where Ramos had been living, they found photographs of blonde boys who strongly resembled Etan.
The psychological toll this took on Stan Patz is just hard to fathom. Every single year on Etan's birthday and on the anniversary of the day he vanished, Stan would mail Jose Ramos a copy of the missing child poster. And on the back of that poster, he would type the exact same haunting message. He wrote, "What did you do to my little boy?"
And Ramos consistently denied involvement and never confessed to the murder. However, the evidence was compelling enough that he was found liable in a 2004 civil wrongful death lawsuit brought by the Patz family. So the case seemed unofficially closed in the eyes of many.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the entire narrative shatters in 2012. 33 years after Etan vanished, a tip comes into the NYPD. The tipster claims his brother-in-law had been confessing to church groups and family members for years that he killed a child in New York back in the late 70s. The man's name is Pedro Hernandez.
And the timeline and location matched perfectly. Back in 1979, Pedro Hernandez was an 18-year-old clerk working at a bodega right there in Soho, mere steps away from Eaton's bus stop.
So police bring Hernandez in for questioning, and he confesses. He tells detectives that he lured Etan down into the bodega basement with the promise of a soda, grabbed him by the neck, choked him until he was still, put him in a plastic bag, stuffed him in a produce box, and threw him away in an alley a few blocks over.
Just brutal.
Right, and on the surface, that sounds like the definitive end of the story.
But the reality of the courtroom was vastly more complicated. The legal hurdles in prosecuting Pedro Hernandez were astronomical. Decades had passed, meaning there was absolutely zero physical evidence.
Right.
No DNA, no crime scene, no security footage, and still no body. The entire prosecution rested entirely on the confession of one man.
And the defense team paints a deeply disturbing picture of how that confession was obtained. They present medical evidence showing that Hernandez has an IQ of around 70, placing him at the border of intellectual disability. Furthermore, he is diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder. This is a condition characterized by severe cognitive distortions, hallucinations, and a profound inability to distinguish reality from imagination.
When you take a highly suggestible, mentally ill individual and place them in an intense, high-pressure police interrogation for 7 uninterrupted hours, the psychological friction is immense.
Oh, absolutely.
The defense argued his confession wasn't a recounting of actual events, but the tragic, fabricated delusion of a broken mind, simply adopting the narrative the authority figures in the room wanted to hear in order to escape the stress of the interrogation.
And to make matters even more chaotic, right in the middle of Hernandez's 2015 trial, there is this bizarre, almost cinematic twist. The NYPD discovers lost boxes of historical evidence from the Patz case just sitting in a storage room in Harlem.
Oh, right. Thousands of pages of documents that had been entirely forgotten.
Right.
It included index cards for every psychic the police ever consulted, old interviews with Jose Ramos, massive amounts of alternate theories. I mean, it was a defense attorney's dream for injecting reasonable doubt into the minds of a jury.
And the sheer volume of reasonable doubt works initially. That first trial in 2015 ends in a mistrial. It was a hung jury, deadlocked 11-1 in favor of conviction. One single juror refused to convict based solely on a confession from a man with severe mental illness.
Right.
The prosecution regrouped, and it wasn't until a retrial in 2017 that a jury finally convicted Pedro Hernandez of kidnapping and felony murder.
He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison.
So you look at that 2017 conviction and you think, okay, the system worked slowly, but it worked. The book is finally closed on the missing milk carton kid. Justice, however delayed, has been served.
Yeah, you'd think so.
But the complexities of constitutional law and the fundamental fragility of how police obtain a confession tore the case wide open again just recently.
On July 21st, 2025, a federal appeals court made a dramatic ruling overturning the conviction of Pedro Hernandez.
So what does this all mean? A conviction that took nearly 40 years to secure, wiped out by an appeals court? Walk us through the mechanics of how a murder conviction just evaporates like that.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of our legal framework, it comes down to a fierce constitutional battle over police interrogation tactics. Specifically, the appeals court focused on a controversial legal maneuver the Supreme Court refers to as the Seibert two-step strategy.
The two-step strategy. It sounds like a dance, but it's actually a psychological trap for suspects.
It really is. When detectives first located Hernandez in New Jersey, they interrogated him for hours before reading him his rights. The standard warnings about the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney.
Right, the Miranda rights.
Exactly. During that prolonged, unmirandized time, he confessed. Then, after they had the confession, they read him his rights, he waived them, and they put him on videotape confessing again. Finally, they drove him to Manhattan, read him his rights a third time, and he confessed to an assistant district attorney.
From a psychological standpoint, the Seibert two-step is incredibly effective, but legally it feels entirely manipulative. It's like letting the cat out of the bag and then asking the suspect to politely put it back in. Once a suspect confesses without knowing their rights, giving them their rights afterward is completely hollow.
Yeah, exactly.
In their mind, the damage is already done. They think, well, I already admitted it. What's the point of staying silent now? So they just keep talking, effectively giving the police a legally clean version of a tainted confession.
The defense argued this wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate tactic designed by investigators to bypass the protections of the Constitution. Now, under New York state law, juries are actually empowered to determine if a confession was given voluntarily. During the 2017 trial, the jury was clearly wrestling with this exact psychological dynamic. They sent a note asking the trial judge a crucial question. They asked, if we decide that the very first unwarned confession in New Jersey was involuntary and tainted, do we legally have to disregard the later videotaped confessions?
Let me guess. The judge told them they could keep the videotaped confessions, completely neutralizing the defense's argument about the tainted interrogation.
Yep. The judge told them, no, you don't have to disregard the later statements. And that specific instruction is what the 2025 Federal Appeals Court zeroed in on. They ruled that the trial judge's instruction was clearly wrong and manifestly prejudicial.
Wow.
Yeah, under federal law, if that initial confession was tainted by a lack of constitutional warnings, the jury needed highly specific legal instructions on how that taint infects the subsequent confessions. Because the judge failed to provide the correct legal framework, the entire conviction was thrown out.
Which puts the justice system in an incredible bind today. In November 2025, the Manhattan District Attorney agreed to retry Pedro Hernandez, but the clock is ticking loudly. By law, this third trial must begin by June 1st, 2026. We are just a few months away from that deadline. If the DA cannot mount a case, Pedro Hernandez walks free.
It is the ultimate stress test of the American justice system. The law requires a level of absolute certainty, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But human memory, cognitive decay, and the simple, relentless passage of 5 decades inevitably destroy that certainty. The physical truth of what happened in that bodega basement is gone. All the courts have left to work with are fading memories, retracted confessions, and really rigid legal procedures.
It is a staggering 46-year journey. One single 6-year-old boy wearing a flight captain hat walks down a sunny street in Manhattan toward a bus stop, and because he didn't make it, an entire national panic was born. His face went onto milk cartons, fundamentally altering the psychology of how a generation of parents raise their children.
Yeah.
His disappearance served as the emotional bedrock for massive federal child protection laws, registries, and alert systems that actively track offenders in our neighborhoods today. And yet, the specific facts of his own case resulted in a tangled constitutional battle over the psychology of police interrogations that just upended a murder conviction in 2025.
His legacy is woven into the very fabric of our modern society, our laws, and our daily routines.
It really is. The next time you are sitting in a quiet meeting or riding the bus and an Amber Alert suddenly buzzes loudly on your phone, remember that you are directly participating in the lasting, echoing legacy of Etan Patz.
Definitely.
But as we wrap up today's deep dive, we want to leave you with a lingering question to mull over, circling back to that idea of the cultural earthquake we discussed at the start. When the rubble has been cleared away for nearly 50 years and all the physical evidence has turned to dust, how do we actually define truth in a courtroom? If a confession alone isn't enough to secure a conviction because the human mind is fragile and legal procedures are infinitely strict, is absolute justice even possible? Or do we have to accept the unsettling reality that sometimes the timeline of a tragedy just goes on forever?